So welcome back after the break. This part of the Monday meeting will be dedicated to the impact of Corona on the French constitutional system. As you probably all know, France has been quite severely hit by the pandemic. As of today, the French authorities count more than 450,000 cases of infection and 31,000 deaths related to the virus. What is more, the French economy has plummeted with the lockdown that was implemented in March and April. And according to estimations of the Banque de France, only in the first trimester of 2020, the French economy actually lost 6% of the GNP. Maybe this has prompted the French President Emmanuel Macron to engage in some kind of warfare rhetoric. When he held a speech to the French citizens, he said that we were in war against the virus and that the population had to stay strong and united to win this fight. 6 months into the pandemic, we can witness a kind of corona fatigue across the Rhine. And we see that actually numbers are going up quite a lot recently, prompting this time local governments to implement special regional measures. You can see that now in Paris you have to wear a face mask. The same is true for Lyon and other big cities, Toulouse. While it is too early to tell whether the French have actually won the war against the virus, we can already at this stage proceed to a first assessment of what it did to the French constitutional system, and this on several layers. Prior to going there, I just want to share with you some of the most recent numbers. So here you can see on the left-hand side the newly registered cases of corona, and on the right-hand side the cumulated cases of corona. So what you see is that with the end of the summer vacation, end of August, beginning of September, what the French call la rentrée, we have seen the first big spikes with last Friday, more than 13,000 cases, new cases being registered in one day. And another map to show you where the pandemic is or where the spread is particularly violent. You can see one part is the region of Paris, and then also in the south of France. And the dot that is actually quite red is a very nice region. It's actually part of the Côte d'Azur, where you had also many people going on vacation. Be that as it may, what I want to share with you today is a presentation that will first discuss the regulatory and the legislative response by the French authorities to the pandemic. And I will then also do a kind of excursion and discuss the emergency regimes that we already have in France under different legal frameworks. Then I will, in a second step, discuss the institutional ramifications of the pandemic management, and this will concern who actually took decisions, how, whether Parliament was involved, and so on and so forth. Then I want to discuss judicial review by making reference to some key decisions, and finally then make some concluding remarks and maybe provide an outlook. So let me start with my overview of regulatory and legislative measures. It is fair to say that the French government has reacted to the virus in, let's say, 3 big phases that I have put on the slide: a pre-emergency phase, an emergency phase, and a so-called transitory phase. I'll come back to this later, what the content of transitory actually means. The first case in France was confirmed on 24th of January. That was actually quite early. And at the time, the idea was that it was easy to be kept at a low number. It turned out that this wasn't true. So on the 12th of February, the then Minister of Health, they had changed in between, he activated the Orsan plan. And Orsan is the French acronym for Organisation de la réponse du système de santé en situation sanitaire exceptionnelle. So basically, it's a plan that the French government has designed to make sure that in case of exceptional circumstances, they can kind of unfold the plan. And this was triggered on the 12th of February, and first measures were already taken. So at the time, infected individuals already had to isolate at home, some schools were closed, big social gatherings were tried to be limited, and so on and so forth. Still, the spread of the virus continued, and then on the 16th of March, the so-called confinement or confinement was ordered. And that was done by a decree. We will come back to this later. So this is the pre-emergency phase. And quite fast after this, the French government then went on and passed a law. It was called an emergency law, and the law had actually three parts. So the first part instituted a new state of emergency, which is called the state of health emergency. In French, état d'urgence sanitaire. The precise content of this will be discussed in a minute. This emergency bill also did two more things. In its second part, it actually, Title II, it allowed socioeconomic measures to be taken. And the third part, very important, ordered the way that the second round of the municipal elections would be conducted. Because you might remember they were pending, and the question is whether they could be conducted despite the spread of the virus or not. And there was no legal basis actually for the postponement. So the law provided the legal basis. On the 11th of March, the so-called déconfinement started. So some of the measures adopted were lifted. And then on the 9th of July started the so-called transitory period. So the law is entitled a law on the exit from the state of emergency. But to be quite frank, many of the measures actually remained in place. Some were lifted. But I think it would be fairer to talk about the state of health emergency light, because if the situation changes, the government can go back to the full-blown scale of the emergency regime. And then finally, only some days ago, the state of emergency was fully lifted on the entire territory because it had still been in place for Guyane and Mayotte, and that was lifted. So now, officially, this emergency phase is finished, and we are in the transitory phase of emergency. As I said before, I'll come back later to what this means, but I would like to now show you these two pictures because I think that they show how hard the confinement actually was in France, and also then discuss what that means. So two places that normally are extremely crowded, Tour Eiffel and Champs-Élysées, and there's absolutely nobody. And that is absolutely unprecedented. And also, I must say, a bit scary to see such a vivid city in such a state of complete shutdown. Now, I want to discuss in a bit more detail the new state of emergency, and for giving you a better idea of what there already is and how that has complemented what there already is, I want to discuss the options the government had and then show you what the government actually did. So the French have a taste for emergency regimes, and that's why there were already different regimes in place before the coronavirus erupted. Under the constitution, this is what the small book shows, and it's in dark gray. You have the state of siège, so état de siège, and you have the very famous Four Powers Clause of the constitution. And on the first one is obviously tied to matters of war, and now it has been codified by the Defense Code. The second one is one where, in case everything really falls apart, the President of the Republic can seize the power and try and navigate the ship through the crisis. It was triggered only once, we have to say, by the person who wanted this clause, Charles de Gaulle, when there was an attempted coup d'etat in Algeria. So in '96, only once. However, there's also the ordinary state of emergency of 1955 that was passed by a law. So there's a law, and under this law, you can also call for the state of emergency, and then the way that institutional prerogatives are actually distributed changes. It was adopted also in the context of the Algeria war and crisis, and it was also triggered 3 times during that period: 1955, 58, 61. It was again triggered in 85 when there were actually aspirations in New Caledonia to secede. Then in 2005, when they were when there was civil unrest in Parisian suburbs, and lately, and this has also sparked quite some criticism, in the wake of the terrorist attacks in Paris in 2015, when this state of emergency actually stayed in place for almost 2 years. On top of this, there's a jurisprudential layer that you see here in white. It's called the exceptional circumstances doctrine, and it dates back to the First World War, 2 judgments by the Council of State. And in essence, this jurisprudential layer that is complementary to what we have seen before, it's not actually replacing them, but it adds just a layer. What it says is, in times of crisis, some acts that would be normally not legal because there are some procedural flaws or substantive problems, they can still be considered legal because it's a time of crisis. So it's actually a means to make sure that even in these difficult times, legality of government action is maintained. And when the French when the first measures were taken on the 16th of March, it was a mixture of the law in place. It's Code de la Santé Publique, so the law actually regulating questions of public health, and this exceptional circumstances doctrine. It actually said in the beginning, because of this exceptional circumstances, we will do this and this and this. It was a backup to make sure that there's actually a basis in the law, and there's a basis also in customs, so to say. But it was judged actually a bit unstable as a legal basis, and that is why then a new state of emergency was instituted, the state of health emergency, by this 2020 Act. What does that new state actually entail? So importantly, it is triggered by a decree that rests on a collegial decision by the Council of Ministers, and actually it is taken upon input by the Minister of Health. So there's a report saying there's really a problem here, then there's the entire government meeting taking a decision, and then there's this decree. It lasts for 1 month, which is longer than what we would have under the ordinary state of emergency, where it's 2 weeks, basically. And after this 1 month, it can be prolonged, but only via a law. So Parliament has to be involved to make sure that then there is also a different branch involved. During that state of health emergency, the Prime Minister is really the key decision-making and rule-making figure, because he or she can take wide-ranging measures on different levels concerning freedoms, so freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, freedom of commerce, freedom of worship. And the Prime Minister can also adopt a range of socio-economic measures, requisite goods, impose price control measures, that's very French, and there's also a catalogue of things. If you don't comply, you can be sanctioned. Importantly, again, the state of health emergency, or tied to the law that was passed, there was a specific part on elections to make sure that the postponement would be legal. There was no basis in French law how to make sure that you can postpone elections, actually. And the government was a bit frightened, so they put this also in, because there's a state of emergency, it's going to be postponed, and the adjournment was kind of legalized. So much for the legal background. So actually the state of health emergency is triggered, and then all the decisions that are taken are codified in the Code de la Santé Publique, so the law on public health. And there's now a special dispositif, a special part of it, in case such a state of emergency is triggered, then the Prime Minister has these and these competences, and these things happen. So what has this done to the overall institutional landscape? The first thing that we see is what I call hypercentralization. So the French Republic is one that is always looking to Paris. We know this, despite many regionalization attempts. And the crisis made this actually quite plain to see. So there was this state instituted, and then hopla, the entire decision-making and also rule-making power moved to Paris. The only two figures that were not in Paris that could still take decisions were actually prefects and mayors. And in the hierarchy of the centralized states, they act as actors of the state at the regional and departmental level and at the local level. So still agents of the state. And you can also see this in the way that decisions were taken in this phase of confinement. All decisions came from Paris. There was very little local governance. Only more recently, we have seen that mayors also adopt measures on wearing face masks and so on and so forth. So the centralization has been a bit rolled back. But in the first 1 month, there was really Paris ruling the rest of the country. I'll come back to the repercussions of this later. What is more is actually that not only there was a hypercentralization to the prime minister, but it's France, there's of course also the president. Even though the president is not formally part of the government, the president was quite active. And actually he convened defense councils. Actually, they're supposed to meet to discuss military and defense matters in case of major crisis on a regular basis before the ministers held their weekly meeting. So first people went in and discussed with the president, comité restreint, and then they went out and then they met again in the Council of Ministers. So you can imagine where decisions were taken in the first or the second meeting. In any case, the president has been quite involved. And it's also interesting to see that the prime minister and the president have kind of their own scientific body in place. So one comité de scientifique for the prime minister, and then comité analyses, recherche et expertise for the president. Of course, they're all involved, but you can see it all goes to Paris, and then it's between Matignon and Élysée, so where the prime minister is and the president, and they discuss it. That leads me to the second part, an stark increase of executive governance. So it's decided basically by means of decree. That is then, ordinances that are actually then binding, and there's a special institution that's called décret réglementaire. And again, it's the minister taking this, the prime minister with input by the Minister of Health, and it allows for really a broad range of measures, not only narrow ones tied to the virus, but also relates to labor law, social security law, commercial law, insolvency law, tenancy law, and so on and so forth. Really a broad area of measures. At the same time, Parliament has been has reduced its own activities. So when the crisis started, several members of the lower chamber, Assemblée Nationale, were infected with the virus. And then there was also a really big concern, and the chamber decided to reduce their activity to two basic things, actually, to discuss urgent legislative matters, and secondly, to maintain weekly question times under very specific format where only a certain number of members were allowed to enter, and so on and so forth. Importantly, in this emergency law, where the state of sanitary emergency or health emergency was instituted, the parliament actually, in more than 40 cases, endowed government with legislative powers. It's called a habilitation, and this was done 40 times. Has never happened before that on so many different topics. There was just a chèque blanc given to the government to order then by decree on such a wide area of measures. And the last one is parliamentary activity, as I said, has been reduced. In recent times, it has been again on the rise because there have been several smaller committees, inquiry committees on how the government has reacted to the crisis. And this is also mediatized. So it is being followed, but still the legislative activity has been quite low. Now, let me come to judicial review. And here I will not go through all the different decisions, but I will briefly summarize what the two bigger courts have done. That's the Conseil d'État and le Conseil constitutionnel. Before that, it's important to recall the division of labor between those jurisdictions. So the Constitutional Council is in charge of constitutional review, and there's a priori and also a posteriori. And the the Conseil d'État is the highest administrative court in charge of reviewing acts part of the administrative order. Now, the state of health emergency, as I told you, shifted decision-making and rule-making to the executive. And then there was a lot of decrees and ordinances adopted. That means that there was plenty of administrative law to be reviewed. And that shifted, again, the importance, or that that actually underlined the importance of the Conseil d'État in judicial review. So many important cases landed at the Conseil d'État. And again, it was that court that was to ensure that certain fundamental freedoms were actually being respected via the system of juge des référés. So when you have a problem, then you can go there and you get a preliminary ruling. And indeed, in the first months of this year, there was a steep increase of cases asking for this review, more than 150 urgent first instance procedures. That's actually quite a lot on a broad array of topics. And early on, the Conseil d'État developed a threefold benchmark and said it would evaluate all the pandemic measures against their appropriateness, necessity, and proportionality. You know this. And in the beginning, it was actually quite differential, saying this was all appropriate, necessary, and proportional. And then after a while, a month or two, it started actually scrutinizing a bit more closely and being less differential. And there's a handful of decisions rendered on different topics where it clearly limited what the government had planned. So first, there was one demand to order total confinement, and then the court says, no, this is not possible, this is absolutely not proportional. Then, importantly, the court also said that in the region of Paris, asylum demands had to, the offices where you go to launch or to depose your demand had to be opened again. And moreover, if you want to contest a decision against you in front of the court, the specialized court, there was only one judge due to the pandemic, and it was judged that now that actually there's déconfinement, there has to be a normal configuration again, it has to be a collegial decision, and so on and so forth. Also, the Conseil d'État said that it would be unproportional to maintain a general ban of gatherings in places of worship. It actually invalidated two measures. One was the surveillance of the Parisian population by drones. It said that this was not okay. And the second one was the use of thermic cameras in schools to make sure that kids were not infected. It also said in the absence of appropriate personal data management measures, this could not be maintained. And finally, on freedom of assembly, there were several important judgments. And here the court bit by bit said there are rules to be respected by those actually demonstrating in the streets, but there can not be a total ban as long as people respect the requirements. And then on the other side, the Conseil constitutionnel, in the first place, that it's okay to prolong the time that it could take to respond to rulings on questions of constitutionality. That's a detail. But importantly, in one of its decisions, it actually said that the health protection by the state enjoyed a constitutional status. It was a decision of the 11th of May, and that was quite something new. If it has a constitutional status, of course, it also gives it a different couleur. And it struck down several parts of the law of the 9th of July. The French government planned that the data related to persons being infected should be shared with different services, including also social security services. And here the court said there's no need for this. This is really excessive. It should only be seen and treated by those institutions that have to do with the pandemic. And also in preventive quarantine, the court said that there must be a judge involved after a while. And the same is true if you are being put in psychiatric isolation for a longer time. A judge has to intervene after a first period to make sure that this is actually not against your rights. That brings me to my conclusions. Actually, it is quite interesting to see that in the crisis, the French government was making significant efforts to remain within the frame of legality and legal certainty. So there were these 10 days of limbo where it was based on a decree plus this doctrine. Then a law was adopted to make sure that this was all orderly and under the framework of legality. And there has been a lot of criticism that the Fifth Republic wouldn't work. And actually, I think it worked quite well according to what's in the Constitution. You might like the way that the Constitution organizes the state, but it worked actually really according to this. So in times of crisis, it is moved to Paris according to the law. The parliament was involved, the law was passed, and so on and so forth. And with the crisis going on, then the regime changed a bit. Importantly was that we have a new state of emergency. As I said, the French have a specific taste for emergency regime, so now there's a new one. We will see when we will need it again, or when it will again be upscaled to the full scale of health emergency. also important is that administrative courts, after first phase where they're a bit unsure and differential, really said there are things that are going against individual freedoms and liberties and limited what the government had intended to do. So they fulfilled their role of guardians of individual freedoms. But I would like to make a last comment on the socioeconomic impact and societal repercussions. You might remember that the lockdown in France was rather long and really strict. You have seen the pictures of the streets in Paris being basically deserted. And already now we can feel first economic repercussions of this. And it's again touching the same people that have already been disadvantaged before the pandemic. And you might remember the social riots of last year. Probably COVID and the reaction to COVID will reinforce these tensions, and it remains to be seen what that means. So my guess is that even once the pandemic will be under control, and we don't know by when that will be, the socioeconomic impact and also societal repercussions will go well beyond that phase, and I think will be important for French politics, at least for the next presidential elections or even the ones coming after this. Thank you very much.